So the purpose of this video is simply to show you a little bit more of working on the horsefly example that I have here using linear perspective, where my vanishing point is to the right hand side, so that I'm going to be seeing the right edge or the right depth of all of these letters. So once again, I'm going to make sure I'm using my ruler, lining up with the vanishing point in the corner of my letter. And again, I tend to stop my diagonal lines once I get to the next letter, because if they overlap, that's fine. Like this one, for instance, is going to overlap. And the depth of that L is going to be sort of behind the Y, and that's totally fine. And then I would just erase the diagonal lines I no longer need. So it's okay if your letters do overlap a little bit. The main thing there is that you want to be careful with your diagonal line drawing, that you keep those diagonal lines light and draw from each corner where the line starts outside of the shape. And draw carefully, because it is an easy thing to get wrong until you get used to it. So here on this F, there are a lot of corners to check. Don't forget to check the ones on the opposite side. So like on this side of the letter, don't forget to check those. And do not forget to check your outer curves. Like on the top portion of my F here, I'm going to have a little bit of the right-hand side of that sort of curved portion. So sometimes it can be more beneficial to have the ruler above the letter, to swing it down so that it just barely touches that outer edge of the letter, and then draw that diagonal line. So then here, this line is going to be parallel to this part, and then when I get to this diagonal line, I'll zoom in a little bit here. When I get to this diagonal line, it's going to come out so that it's parallel to this part. And then at the next diagonal line, it's going to go up, so it's parallel to this. So on each diagonal line, you'll want to check to make sure that you are working in a way that is parallel with the front. So the diagonal lines are basically the main point at which each of your back ending lines is going to change directions. So this one, for instance, goes behind my L here. So it would look something like that. So you can see a little bit there about how those letters would overlap. But because I want the L to be in front of the Y, I'm then just going to erase that little corner of the F that goes behind it, erase that diagonal line, and then I'm going to add in the side here that I'm going to see. So this line for the back part here technically continues up, because this side of the F continues up. So it looks a little bit funny in here, but you can see that this line, for instance, continues up along that F, so then it has to be on this side as well. So it's going to have a weird little overlap with this portion, but then once we get to the coloring and the shading step on the letters, all of that will make a little bit more sense, because this is basically the same side, the same depth and thickness as this particular spot here. So hopefully that is kind of clear there. And then this is the bottom part here. There's not going to be much of it because of where we are in relation to our vanishing point. So then the next thing I'm going to do is my E, which again, I'm going to be using the outer edges of my curves primarily. So corner to vanishing point. This corner, the line would start inside of the vanishing point, so I'm not going to draw that. But then from this inner part of the E, it goes out here. And then this corner of my E goes out. And then that upper curve, again, for the top of the E, would go towards the vanishing point from here. And then I know that on the inside, if my letter were thin enough or if my opening were thick enough, I would see where that depth ends or begins. But because I know that that's a really small opening, the whole inside is just going to basically be the right-hand side of this part. So now I'm going to close this off with a line that is parallel to the front. A line parallel again to the front. And then this is actually going to come down. And then this part of the E comes in front of it. And then this comes up behind part of the F. I'm going to darken some of my lines. Remember, the inside here is just going to be basically this side continuing up. So hopefully that makes sense. And then I would erase my diagonal lines because I no longer need those. The more you practice with linear perspective, the more sense it will make, and the more easily you will be able to determine which parts of each letter you are seeing and how to then create those parts of the letters. So now I'm moving to the S. And on an S, you're going to use a lot of those outer edges of your curves, especially like on this example where the S is to the right-hand side, you're going to see a lot of the sides of an S. So right now I'm just drawing the diagonal lines in from corners and edges. I'm going to do the line from this corner as well on the back of my S. So this part here, I'm going to see the whole side of this part of the S, pretty much. But it is going to go behind my E. So I'm going to use draw through to just continue drawing that up until I basically get to my next diagonal line, because then that diagonal line will wrap around in front of it to be sort of the bottom or the top part of that S. And then I'm going to draw the curve here parallel to the very edge. And then this back end is going to be parallel to the front here. So because my vanishing point is to the right-hand side of that S, it's going to look a lot different than it would if my vanishing point were a bit lower or a bit higher, because we don't always see this much of the inside of that letter, but in this particular case we do. And then I'm going to erase where I have used the draw through. And draw through is just an art technique that helps you figure out the placement of things when something is in front of them. So for instance, we continued this line through the E as if the E were not there, so that we can make sure that this part and this part both remained accurate. Now, if my vanishing point were lower, I would not see this part and my curve would kind of stop here. So I'll show you that on another example as well. But right now I'm going to go ahead and finish out the H, the O, and the R. So right here is actually a really good example of how I would actually change a letter, because if I were to draw this diagonal line, it shows me I would see a little bit of the bottom of the R, but not enough to really make it very visible. So what I would do in that case is actually just make the R a little bit longer, so that I don't see the bottom of it at all, and I only see the side. Just because that's going to make it easier to draw. You can also change the angle of it a little bit if you wanted to make it more like this type of a shape, to really guarantee that you're not going to see the bottom of this part. That's totally fine. And then corners here. Corners again. Back to the vanishing point, always. The corner of the sort of stick of the R here. And then I'm not going to go from these corners because I know it would start inside of my letter. So then here, this line, I'm going to actually extend my diagonal line a little bit into that S, because my R should be parallel here, but again, it's going to go behind the S. but I wanted to go ahead and draw it because we're going to have very much the same thing we had on the S, where that curve is going to come down parallel to the front, and we're going to use draw through and then erase the portion that is on the S. Or if I wanted to, I could actually leave that portion that's on the S and erase the S out, because then I could just go ahead and make the R be in front of the S. It's completely up to you in terms of which letters you have in front and which letters you have behind. So I'm going to work on my O now, which obviously I'm going to be using the curves. And then these are just going to curve parallel to the front. Once again, sort of overlapping with that R. So at this point, I could erase the R out of the O, or I could erase the O out of the R. I'm just going to put the O in front and erase that little bit of the R and keep that curve parallel with the front here. And then on the inside here, I'm just going to draw sort of where I might see sort of the right-hand side of this part of the O, because the O opening is larger than the E opening, so I'm going to see where that inside ends, where I did not on the E. So on the H, I'm going to use my corners and my vanishing point, corner and vanishing point, the top curve up here to the vanishing point, corner of the top to the vanishing point, corner of the back to the vanishing point. But then this line would line up with that one, so I'm not even going to draw that. Going to get that line going down here parallel with the front end of my H, going right through the O for now using draw through. And then the back is going to be parallel again to the front. And then again parallel up here to the front. And then once more right here. And keep in mind, you're not going to see the top and you're not going to see the exact bottom here, because this spot where it kind of goes behind the front is going to be sort of on the same line where the side goes behind the front, so that you don't ever see the top and the bottom of anything at the same time. You either see the top or the bottom or just the sides. You don't see top, bottom, and sides of anything. So once again, you can see that I've used draw through on that H. So now I'm going to actually erase the H out of the O and put the O in front of the H there so that it's a little more legible. And now that letter, those words, would actually be ready to go ahead and have all the diagonal lines erased, have my edges cleaned up, potentially with a pen. A lot of people do like to outline with a pen. And then I would go in and I would add sort of different decorative elements if I wanted to, like on my example here, how I've got like the little, the horseshoe pattern. I've got some wings here. I've got a fly's eye here. And then I've used purples for all of my depth portions, and then just different colors that I use within the visual pun for the word itself. But we will talk very specifically about the coloring steps for the letters, because the primary purpose of this set of videos, once again, sorry about that, is just to make sure that you understand how to do the actual three-dimensional lettering portion using linear perspective.